Welcome back to my Road to Rapid Top 1000 series, in which I play rapid games with the time control 15 minutes and 10 seconds increment to try to train my skills in longer time formats and bring you some pretty interesting educational games in the process. Now, I decided to switch up my piece theme for this episode. I got a bit tired of the bases that I was running for the previous episodes, so this one looks a little bit cleaner, and I thought maybe it would help me play better, and I wasn't wrong. So in this game, I was playing against a Saudi Arabian opponent with the username Black Horse Chess, and he opened with d4. And so I went for knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, and now rather than go into a King's Indian, which I've been playing lately with immediate bishop g7, after which he would play e4, I instead went for d5, the Grünfeld Defense, which I actually have not played in a while in a rapid game, but I did play it in the second episode that I ever made in this series, and I had a very dynamic battle, and that's what this opening leads to a lot of times. Because after pawn takes, knight takes, he then plays e4, and after the knights are traded, we see that white is able to establish this sort of traditional pawn center with a pawn on e4 and d4, and also this pawn on c3, which tends to become a target. And basically, black is okay with this because they're then going to play something like bishop g7, c5, knight a6, bring their queen in, and try to target these pawns, especially the one on d4 and c3. So it leads to a very dynamic battle. And so I continued with bishop g7 here, and he goes for bishop c4, c5, knight e2, I castle, bishop e3. This is all pretty standard theory. We were both making these moves very quickly, especially my opponent. He was just blitzing these moves out at lightning pace. And here I play knight c6, and white can take this pawn, but then his structure becomes all messed up with these three pawns all over the place. Black can play something like queen a5 or knight e5 at some point. They're going to usually win a pawn back. So white usually doesn't want to take. Instead, he just castles. And here I went for bishop g4, which is, again, still theory. The theory in the Grünfeld runs very deep. It's not very important for the purpose of this episode. But here he plays f3, and now knight a5. And now there's an idea for white where they sacrifice this bishop and then take on g4. And again, this is all like a deep line of theory, but here instead my opponent went back with bishop d3. And this is kind of the first point where I started to really think. He even, at one point, I had to disable the chat because he started literally messaging me suggestions on what moves to make because he was just so eager to play this game. He had like 17 minutes at this point, which is more than the 15 that he started out with. He was just making these moves so quickly that he was just getting more and more time. But here I had a little bit of a decision. I could immediately take on d4, or I could drop the bishop back. And I eventually decided to take first, as if he takes my bishop, I take his, which is good for me because, again, his pawns are all messed up. Instead, he took, and now I drop the bishop back. And now he decided to play, very quickly I should say, rook c1, which I don't think is the best move. d5 looked actually quite interesting because it attacks the bishop, and now white has this very nice pawn chain. But I was thinking about taking the rook. And after that, after queen takes, the problem is now he gets this very long diagonal, and after something like bishop d7, he can even play bishop h6 and attack my rook, and at the same time threaten mate, meaning I would have to play f6 and give the rook back. And then we would get into somewhat of a simplified position where he's a little bit better. But he decided to immediately play rook c1 first, which puts the rook on an open file, but it does leave this pawn behind. So I immediately started to think, can I just take this pawn? And when you see a hanging pawn and you want to take it, first you have to slow down a little bit and just check around first, because you don't want to rush headfirst into a trap. You don't want to get your pieces trapped or walk into some kind of a fork or some kind of discovered attack, who knows. So you have to calculate. But I saw that after I take this pawn, there's no real way for him to trap me or to create any very serious tactics. So I decided to just take this pawn because by doing so, not only do I win a pawn, but now I have two connected passed pawns on the queen side, which, if played correctly, could be a very serious advantage. So here he played queen a4, as kind of I was predicting. He's attacking the bishop, getting his queen into a more active position. So I drop the bishop back to b3, attacking his queen. He goes queen b4. And now I have to be careful because his queen is putting pressure on both of my minor pieces here. And if I'm not careful, like, they could fall under attack, could be lost. So I decided to play queen b6, offering him a queen trade, but he then took on e7, which, to be honest, I did miss. I forgot that I was hanging a pawn there. But it's actually not bad, because even though he gets a pawn back, I still have these two passed pawns on the queen side, and now it's my turn. I can make some active moves. So here I decided to play rook f to d8, putting some pressure on d4. Maybe not the best move. What I also could have done was something like knight c6, which now hits his queen. Queen probably has to go somewhere back to a3. And then I can play something like rook to d8 and target this pawn. But instead I played immediately rook d8. And now it's his move, and this position is getting quite tricky, because as you see, he has these 5 connected pawns, which all form one giant pawn island, and I instead have 2 pawn islands with 3 over here and 2 over here. And in this position, he has to be careful because, like I said, this pawn is falling under a tremendous amount of pressure. And he can't even play something like d5 because then his bishop falls. So he played queen c5, looking to trade queens and relieve some tension. So I took, and now again, he has to be careful. What would you take with here? Would you take with this pawn? I hope not, because that loses the bishop. So you have to take with the rook. And now I play the move knight c6, which retreats the knight, and now, again, targets this pawn. And now he played rook b1, which hits my bishop, but also is eyeing this b7 pawn as soon as the bishop moves back, which I brought it back to e6. But now this allows him a little bit of a fork on d5 here, attacking my bishop and my knight, and it may look like I'm losing a piece entirely, but fortunately for me, to counter the fork, I actually have a pin. So very complicated stuff going on here in the middle game. I have to save one of my pieces, so I played knight to e5 here. And now at least I'm attacking his bishop. So he took my bishop first, and now I don't take with the knight, because if I do, he then takes here with check, and after king takes, he's able to take with another check. And now I'm just down a pawn. Looks very dangerous. So instead I took with the rook first, and after pawn takes, I'm able to recapture with the knight. And now if you were to take here, it would not be a check, and he has to first deal with his bishop being attacked. So now where to move the bishop for him? Well, the correct thing to do here would actually been to defend the bishop by bringing the king in, because now the bishop is well protected and there's not going to be any back rank issues. Instead, he played the move after knight takes f7, bishop f2, which looks like a safe move. You're just dropping the bishop back into this little pocket, but it's actually a mistake. Because now, let's say I make some random move like h6 just to demonstrate my point. He can't take on b7 because his back rank is now weak. As we saw in a previous video, I had shown a game where my opponent rushed in to take a pawn very similarly to this and left his back rank vulnerable, and now rook to d1 check attacks the king, and how do you block the check? Only way is to give up the bishop, and now black is winning. But anyway, at this point, the game has reached definitely an early endgame where, as I mentioned earlier, there's 2 pawn islands. He has these 4 pawns, and I have these 2 over here and these 2 over here. But what is going to be the critical plan for me to execute in this game? Pause and try to figure out what you would do going forward here with the black pieces. So the winning plan for black is going to, of course, be to take this a-pawn and push it all the way to the end zone. Because not only is it a very powerful pass pawn, but more importantly, it has the support of this bishop, very powerful bishop, which controls this entire diagonal, is practically unopposed. So I wasted no time, and I actually got pretty low on time throughout this game, as I didn't know the kind of opening theory as well as he did. But here I knew exactly what to do, and I played a5. And I'm not worried about this pawn here, because all I need is this one guy to win. If I can get it all the way down to the edge of the board, he will have to give up a piece, maybe even a rook, to stop me from creating a queen. So here he played the move knight to f4, at least trying to create first some counterplay with the knight. He's attacking my rook. And this is where I made a bit of a mistake. What I probably should have done was keep my rook over here, kind of on the offensive, putting pressure on his second rank. Instead, I brought it back to try to defend this pawn, but this allows him now to bring his knight in, and I have to be careful again. If I play a4, what does this allow him? Well, it allows him a very nasty fork. Now, he's going to pick up a rook in exchange for a knight. So now I had to bring my rook back a second time, and this allows him to take the pawn. But I was unfazed by this. I don't need this pawn to try to win this game. All I need is the a-pawn. So here, before I started pushing it, I decided to get my knight into the game, seeing as how also, if I'm not careful, he may create some kind of threats here with the rooks. You always have to be careful when your opponent gets 2 rooks on your 7th rank, or 2nd if you're playing white. So I played knight d6, and now the rook is under attack, so he has to move it, and he brought it back to b3. And now I get to push. And after rook a3, now what's the next step? To bring another piece more into the attack? Rook d to b8. Now the rook assumes a completely open b file. It even threatens another back rank hit, and he has to be careful. He played the move bishop to e3, at least creating some space for his king to move to. And now I come in with another threatening move, rook to b3. This trade would be very much in my favor, because if he takes, now how is he stopping this pawn? Well, he can't, because the rook has no way to come here due to the knight. And if the rook comes all the way here, I can then push this pawn. And after rook b1, rook jumps into a1, and it's game over, because if he takes, I take and make a queen. And he can't even really defend the knight, because this very powerful bishop once again guards this entire diagonal. So he knows he can't take. So he decided to, again, drop back. This is what you get when you have a passed pawn and the opposite side is trying to blockade. Basically, the game plan is to try to attack the blockaders and force them back and try to advance the pawn step by step. And here I could have continued with something like a3 or maybe knight b5, but I found a very nice tactic. And I want to help you kind of find it too. So whenever you see a bunch of your opponent's pieces lined up on a specific diagonal, especially one on which their king is, this should be sort of a light bulb in your head going off that there might be a little bit of a tactic in place here. So here I played the move, rook takes e3, sacrificing my rook temporarily for the bishop. But if you were to take, now I'm able to come in with bishop d4, which forks the rook and attacks the knight. And moreover, I'm going to take the knight with check. So after something like this, it's a check. And now I have a very nice knight and bishop and rook against 2 of his rooks. But this rook is very passive. It's just desperately trying to stop this pawn from advancing. So after rook takes e3, he tried to be clever and played the move rook to c6, now looking to take my knight while my rook is hanging. And I could have actually just moved my rook over to b3, and after rook takes knight, then push this pawn, and eventually I would win. But I decided to be a little bit cheeky myself and played bishop d4, setting a trap for him. If he were to take the knight, then what would happen? Well, mate in 1 would happen with a nice double check against the king. So he didn't do that. He now just realized that he has to give up the knight, so he took, and I take with check, and now king f1. And now the game is almost won. I have 2 very active pieces, the bishop and the knight, and I have, of course, still this pass pawn, but I still have to be precise here, because if I misplace my pieces, he might be able to like create a rook fork, or he might be able to sneak up with this rook and win this pawn. So I have to be still a little bit careful. And I played knight b5, just getting the knight into the action. He played rook c4. Now 2 attackers on the pawn, but it moves forward. Now supported by the knight and the rook. And now he played king e2, attacking the bishop. Bishop has to draw back, so I drop back to f4. A little bit more precise would have actually just been to put it on d4, but my move was also fine. And now he attacked my knight. And now this is kind of the critical final step of the game. I have to figure out what to do with the knight. And I also have to be quite precise. If I just drop it back, this allows him to then play rook c3 and try to win the pawn back. So here I had to calculate a little bit precisely and find a nice sequence of maneuvers with the knight. And when I was sure that it would work, I played knight to d4 check. And now the move that white actually has to make to not just lose the game is a very unnatural looking king to f2, which is just counterintuitive because you want your king to be closer to the action, but if it goes towards the action, you see what happens. I now am able to play knight b3, and now he's in big trouble because not only is the rook hit, but I'm also threatening with the support of the bishop a fork to attack his king and his rook, so he's simply losing material. He played rook c3, and now if he had just one extra move, maybe he'd be able to take the pawn, but knight c3 comes with check, king is hit, and rook is hit. Has to give up the rook, and after bishop takes, I'm able to now trap his rook here on a2, and he realized that his only chance is to, well, not really a chance, but he has to give up the rook. But after pawn takes, king takes, I simply played rook c8, and in this position he resigned as the rook completely cuts off his king. It's never going to be able to come close to the pawns, which even though he has a 4 against 2 majority, his king is immobilized, so all my king is going to have to do is just come here, sweep up the pawns, and it's going to be an easy conversion. So, of course, understanding this, he resigned after 43 moves, and I got a nice victory. So I think that game kind of shows the power of an advanced, or outside, I should say, passed pawn. To bring it back to the critical point, when it started moving, this is the position. A passed pawn, very powerful, especially with the support of this bishop, which controlled the queening square. And in that situation, all you really got to do is start to get the pawn pushing and use your other pieces to attack white's blockaders. Now, as far as my rating, it has dropped quite low. I was at around 1920 in the last episode, but I'm coming right back. This is a nice win here to start a comeback, and I'm just going to try to get back up to where I was and keep on grinding. Stay tuned for more.